Every man who passes it tells the same story. Says a fellow named Elias Vance built that empire out of nothing. Says he was a giant of a man. Says he had the vision. I hauled grain to that mill for 19 years. I kept the weights in a tally book. I keep everything in a tally book. My wife says I'd write down my own funeral, and I want to tell you something before I'm too old to be believed. Elias Vance married that woman because he needed hands. Not a wife, hands, somebody to sack flour and cook and not complain about the noise. He wrote it plain in the letter. I saw the letter. And 40 years later, 3 states buy their bread from what she built out of the wreck he left behind. She never once corrected the sign. That's the part I still can't get right in my head. The water came up the night of the 14th of May, 1884, and I was standing in it to my thighs holding a lantern over a man's arm while it was being eaten. That's the way to say it. Eaten. The gears took him at the wrist and drew him in the way a mother pulls a child across a road, patient and certain, and Elias Vance was screaming in a register I have never heard from a human throat before or since, high, thin, almost polite, like he was apologizing for the noise. The mill was going because the flood was turning the wheel. That's the whole cruelty of it. Nobody had thrown the gate. The Cimarron had come up brown and shouldering out of the dark, tore the race open, and shoved that big undershot wheel around like a boy spinning a coin. And the great oak drive shaft turned, and the pit gears turned, and the whole building woke up in the middle of the night with nobody at the helm of it, grinding on nothing. And Elias had gone down into the wheel pit with a crowbar to jam the works, and the water knocked his feet, and his hand went where his hand went. I got there because the Vance's dog came to my place. 2 miles. A yellow bitch named Pearl with a bad hip who wouldn't cross the yard for a beefsteak, and she swam a flood to come get somebody, and I have thought about that dog more than is reasonable for a grown man. So the lantern, the water, the screaming. And Ruth Vance coming down the ladder into the pit in her nightdress with an axe. I want to be careful here because the story gets told wrong. They say she cut his hand off. That's not what happened. What happened is she put the axe head into the gear teeth, into the gears, the iron, the moving part, and jammed the crown wheel, and the whole mill made a sound I felt in my back teeth, a sound like a church bell dropped down a well, and the shaft stopped, and the axe helve snapped off clean at her fist, and she stood there in the black water holding 18 inches of hickory with the veins standing in her forearms. Then she said, "Corbin, lantern." Not help, not God, not Elias. Lantern. I brought it. She looked at what was left of his arm below the elbow, and she looked at his face, and she said, quiet, like she was reading it off a card, "It's off already. The rest is meat." Elias fainted, merciful, and she took the belt off her husband's own trousers and put it above his elbow and twisted it with the broken axe helve until his skin went white above the wrap, and she never once made a sound. I remember what it smelled like down there. Wet stone, river mud, cornmeal, sweet and dusty and wrong, floating on the water in a scum, and under it the smell that comes off a man opened up, which is a smell like a copper penny held too long in a hot hand. I wrote all that down later, every bit. I have the page. The last line on it says, "RV did not cry, her hands did not shake, her chin did." Now I have to go backwards, because you don't understand yet what you're looking at. Elias Vance was 39 years old that spring, and he had inherited the mill from his father, Absalom Vance, a Pennsylvania man who'd hauled 2 French burstones, real French burrs, quarried at La Ferté, the kind of stone a miller talks about the way other men talk about horses, hauled them by ox from Missouri in 1867, and set them up on the Cimarron because he had looked at that ford and seen the whole future of Kansas passing over it. He was wrong about that. The future went where the railroad went, and the railroad went 11 miles north, through Dunning's town. Absalom died still expecting to be right. Elias was not a bad man. I want that in the record. He was a tired man, which in my experience does more damage over a lifetime. He had a big body and a small store of hope, and he ran that mill alone after his mother passed. And by the winter of '83, he was grinding maybe 400 bushels a month when the stones could do 100 a day. And he had a note at Amos Dunning's bank in Osterhout for $640, and he had nobody. So he did what men did. He wrote to a matrimonial paper. I know what the letter said because Ruth showed it to me. Once. Years on. She kept it in the mill office in the drawer where the sample scoops were, and she took it out and unfolded it and let me read it and folded it back up, and neither of us said one word about it after. It said, and this is near exact, I copied it in my book that night. I am not a young man nor a handsome one. I do not drink. I have a mill on good water with a stone house of 2 rooms. I want a woman who is strong and can work. There will be sacking and hauling, and the noise is considerable. I cannot promise affection, but I can promise I will not raise my hand nor my voice. If this is agreeable, right. That's the whole thing, that's the marriage. He married her to help at the mill. He wrote it down and mailed it, and a woman read it and said yes. Ruth Lyle was 31, and she came from a place in Ohio she never named to me in 19 years. She had 1 carpet bag and a fiddle case with no fiddle in it. I never learned what was in it, only that she carried it off the coach herself and wouldn't let Elias take it. And she had a way of standing with her weight on both feet square, like a thing built rather than born. She was not beautiful. I say that with respect. She had a jaw on her and a mouth that went straight across and pale eyes set too deep, and when she was thinking she'd press her thumbnail into the pad of her forefinger, hard, until it left a little white crescent. That was her tell. I watched for it for 2 decades, and I never once saw her do it in front of a man she was bargaining with. They were married in March of '83 by a circuit preacher in the mill yard with me and Willie Prout standing as witness, and Willie was 9. There was no dancing. She went to work the next morning, sacking, hauling, keeping books she could figure, which surprised him, and I saw his face when he found out, and it wasn't gratitude. It was a kind of dismay, like a man who'd bought a mule and found a horse and now had to think about fences. 14 months later, he was in that pit with his arm in the gears. He didn't die. That's the first surprise, and it belongs to Ruth. She kept him from bleeding out, and Dr. Speck came out from Osterhout on the 20th of May when the water dropped enough to cross, and he took the arm properly 4 inches below the shoulder, on the kitchen table, and Ruth held the lamp and handed him what he asked for. Speck told me afterward, on the porch, rolling a cigarette with hands that had gone shaky the way they do once it's over. She asked me the price. Now, before I opened my bag, she asked what it would cost and whether I'd take part in meal. He licked the paper. I have amputated on that table, Holloway. I have never been invoiced on it. I said something like, well, she's cold. Speck looked at me a long while. He was a hard little man with a drinker's nose and no patience. He said, she asked because if she couldn't pay me, she was going to do it herself, and she wanted to know before I got him drunk. And then he went and sat in his buggy for a while before he drove off. Amos Dunning came on the 9th of June. Now, Dunning wasn't a villain, and I'm going to disappoint you there. Villains are easy. Dunning was worse than a villain. He was correct. He was a small, neat, kind-faced man who wore a linen duster to keep the dust off, and he had the note on the mill, and he came out with his clerk and stood in the yard looking at the wrecked race and the silt in the flume and the wheel with 4 broken buckets, and he did arithmetic in his head, and he was not wrong. Elias was in the bed in the front room. He'd been in it 26 days. He weighed maybe 140, and he smelled like laudanum, and the sheets needed changing, and he wouldn't let Ruth change them. Dunning didn't go in. He stood in the yard and he talked to Ruth Vance, who came out with flour to her elbows, because she had been grinding by hand on a little tabletop mill Absalom had used for samples, 20 pounds a day. Because 2 families down the creek had nothing else and had come to her, and she had not said no. Dunning said, "Mrs. Vance, $300 and I take the note and you keep the house through the winter." That's a bad offer, but it's not a mad one. The mill was worth maybe 800 whole and it was not whole, and there wasn't a soul in the county who thought a one-armed man and a woman could put that race back in before the wheat came off. She said no. He said, "Ma'am, you don't have a miller." And she said, and I was standing right there holding my hat, and I wrote it in my book that night, and I have never had to check the page. "I don't have a miller, I have a mill." Dunning smiled. He had a real kind smile. That's what made him hard to hate. That's a fine thing to say. Say it to the stones. "I intend to." "The note's due in November." "I know when the note's due, Mr. Dunning. I wrote the date in the book. You didn't." She wiped her hands on her apron. "November 14th, not the 15th like you told the Prutes. You told them wrong and took a week's interest off them, and they can't read a calendar and I can, and I'll say so in town if you'd like me to." The clerk stopped writing. Dunning looked at her for what felt like a long time. Then he put his hat back on and said, quite gently, "November 14th then," and got in his buggy. And she stood in that yard with her thumbnail pressed white into her finger until his dust was down. Then she went and vomited behind the corn crib, quietly, and washed her mouth at the pump, and went back inside to her husband. I never told anybody that until now. The race is the thing nobody thinks about. Everybody thinks a mill is a wheel. A mill is a ditch. 600 feet of ditch cut across the bend, so the water comes to the wheel with a temper on it, and the flood had torn the head gate off and shoved the whole upper 40 feet full of sand and cottonwood and one dead cow. It wanted a millwright. There was one in the county, old Soder, and he was 70, and he had 11 jobs before hers, and none of them owed money to Dunning's bank. So she got Tsaya. I need to tell this part straight, and it's the part I get argued with about at the store, so let me be plain. In June of 1884, there was a Chiricahua man living in a dugout on the Salt Fork, 8 miles up, and he had been there since '78 and nobody rightly knew how he'd come north or why he'd stayed. And the town called him a name I won't put in your ears, and I used it too then, and I'm ashamed of it now, at 81, sitting here. His name was Tsaya. He had a bad eye from something he never explained, and he was maybe 50, and he could work water like a priest works a congregation. He'd built a little diversion off the Salt Fork to run a garden, corn, squash, melons, in a country that would not grow melons for a white man with a windmill. And Ruth Vance had ridden past it once in April, and stopped her mule for 11 minutes and looked at the way he'd set his check dams, and then rode on. That's the whole reason. She had looked at his ditch. She rode up there on the 21st of June, and she did not bring a gun, and she did not bring me, though I offered, and she came back at dusk with him walking beside the mule. The Prutes stopped bringing corn. 2 families stopped. A man named Rennick stood in my yard and told me she'd invited a savage onto Wildland, and I said something back that cost us the friendship. And I did not say it because I was good. I said it because I had held a lantern in that pit, and I had seen who was and was not useful in this world. Tsaya looked at the race for 2 days without touching a shovel, just walked it, sat on the bank. Once he lay down flat on his belly at the wash and put his ear to the sand. Elias watched from the window and said from the bed, in a voice like a door dragging, "She's paying that man in flour to sleep on my bank." Ruth said yes. And on the 3rd day Tsaya said the head gate was in the wrong place and always had been, that Absalom Vance had set it where the bank looked strongest instead of where the water wanted to turn, and that every flood since 1867 had been trying to teach him this and he had not listened, and that if they set it 40 feet upstream at the gravel and let the sand run through a bay instead of fighting it, the race would clean itself every spring. Elias from the bed said his father had built that gate. Tsaya said yes, and the river has been arguing with him for 17 years. It is a patient argument. And then, after a moment, with a small dry crack in his voice that I did not recognize as humor until I was 3 miles down the road going home, "The river will win. It always wins, but it does not mind if you make it comfortable." They moved the gate. 41 days. Ruth, Saya, Willie Prout, whose mother whipped him for it and who came anyway, and me on the Sundays I could steal. Ruth dug. I want that understood. She dug like a hired Irishman, 10 hours, and came up out of the ditch at dark with her hands wrapped in rag and went in the house and cooked and fed her husband with a spoon, because he would not use his left hand in front of her, and then came out and sat on the step and pressed her thumbnail into her finger. She lost 14 pounds. She had none to lose. And on the 2nd of August, they threw the new gate and the water came down the new race and hit that wheel and the wheel turned slow, then not slow, and the shaft turned, and the pit gears took, and the runner stone came up to speed with a sound like a big animal clearing its throat, and Ruth Vance stood in the meal floor with her hand flat on the vibrating oak and she laughed. I had never heard it in 17 months. She laughed like a girl once, and clapped her hand over her own mouth like she'd said something filthy. Then the wheat came off, and nobody brought it to her. That's the part they leave out of the sign. It wasn't dunning. It was the farmers, and it was not even cruelty exactly. It was that a man hauls 40 bushels of hard winter wheat, his whole year, and he wants it ground by a miller, and a miller is a man, and what was at Vance's Ford was a widow-not-widow and a one-armed man in a bed and an Apache on the head gate. And if the toll was mistaken or the stones dressed wrong, he'd have nothing and no recourse. So they hauled 11 miles north to Osterhout, to the roller mill, which Dunning's bank held paper on. She ground 9 bushels the first week of harvest. 9. I sat with her on the loading step on a Sunday evening in September, and there was a smell of hot iron off the cooling stones and no dust in the air at all, which in a mill is the sound of a heart not beating, and she said, "Corbin, tell me the truth. Is it because I'm a woman?" I said it was. She nodded. She'd known. She'd wanted somebody to say it out loud so she could stop wondering if she was a fool as well. Then she said, "Then I won't grind wheat." And I said something stupid like, "Ruth, it's a flour mill." And she looked out at the sorghum. There was sorghum cane standing in every bottom in that county, that fall, second crop stuff, planted for feed because the corn had drowned in the same flood that ate her husband's arm, and it was standing there 12 feet high and worth nothing, because there was no sorghum mill within 60 miles, and cane won't keep. Cane sours in 4 days. Cane is a crop that must be crushed now or be garbage, and every man in that valley was going to plow his under. And Ruth Vance said, "There is 1,000 acres of money rotting in the bottoms, and they're all standing around waiting on a miller to be a man." Here's the heavy thing. Here's the part I've thought about my whole life. To grind cane, you don't want burrstones. You want rollers, 3 iron rollers on a frame, and you want a boiling train, pans, a skimmer, cordwood, barrels. It is a different business entire. It's syrup. She had no money. She had a note due November 14th. She had 2 French burrstones. La Ferté. Absalom Vance had hauled them 1,000 miles by ox, and they were the only thing on that place worth real cash to a real man. And a mill man in Wichita named Hoyt had offered $40 for the pair in '81, and Elias had thrown him off the property. She sold them. She sold them on the 29th of September to Hoyt's agent for $110 and the cost of the freight, and she bought a used 3-roller cane mill out of Sedalia and 800 feet of pipe and a boiling pan and cordwood, and she did it while her husband was asleep in the front room with the curtains pulled, and she did not ask him, and she did not tell him. I hauled the stones out myself. She asked me to. She said she wouldn't have a stranger do it. And I backed my wagon up to the meal floor door, and Saya and Willie, and I rolled that runner stone off its spindle and got it down the plank, 4 foot across, 1,200 pounds, and Ruth stood at the head of the plank with her back to the house, so she didn't have to see the window. And when it was on the wagon, she put her hand flat on it, the way you'd touch a horse you were selling. There was writing chiseled in the eye of that stone. Absalom had done it. It said AV 1867, and under it, small, "A good stone finds its own water." Ruth read it. I watched her read it. Then she said, "Cover it with the tarp, Corbin, it'll take the weather," and went inside and made supper. He found out on the 11th of October. He was up by then, up and worse for it, because a man in a bed can pretend, and a man walking through his own mill cannot. He'd learned to sack one-handed by then, kneeling on the sack, and he could dress a stone with the pick strapped to his stump, and he was proud of it. He had shown me. He had shown me twice, and there is nothing on this earth heavier than a proud man showing you a thing twice. He walked out on the meal floor, and the spindle was bare. The sun came through the west window the way it does in October, thick, full of chaff that wasn't there anymore. And there was just the empty bedstone and the bright ring on the floor where the case had sat. And out in the yard, the new cane rollers were half set on green timbers with Saya crouched over them. And the whole valley smelled like green cane and wood smoke, because the boiling had started at Cheney's, and hers was next. I was there. God help me, I was there, standing in the door with a bill of lading in my hand. Elias stood on that empty ring for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Where are my father's stones?" Ruth was on the ladder. She came down. She wiped her hands. She did not lie, and she did not soften it, and she did not begin with the reasons, which I have come to understand is either the greatest courage there is or the greatest coldness, and I am 81 and I still don't know which. She said, "Wichita, $110. I bought a cane mill and pipe and 11 cords of wood." He said, "You sold my father." I sold 2 rocks. "You sold my father." "Elias?" She stepped toward him and he stepped back and she stopped. "There's no wheat coming. There is no wheat coming ever, not while I'm standing here, not while they can go north. I have sat in this yard for 6 weeks and watched empty road. The note is 34 days. If I do nothing, we are put off in November, and your father's stones go to Dunning at auction for $9 apiece, and they will use them for a doorstep and a horse block. I have seen it done. In Ohio, I have seen it done." And Elias Vance began to shake. He was a big man once. He was a wreck by then, one sleeve pinned, hair gone gray at the sides in 5 months, and he stood on that bright ring on the floor and he shook, and what came out of him was not rage, which we could have all survived. He said, "You should have let me die in the pit." The mill was very quiet. "Ruth, you should have let go of the belt. You'd have had the place clean." His voice broke on it and got worse for breaking, got reasonable. "You'd have had it clean and no one would say a word against you. You could have a widow can run a mill, they'd have pitied you into it, they'd have hauled to a widow." Elias. "And instead you've got me. You've got a stump and a bed and a man who can't lift a sack, and you sold my father to feed him." He laughed. "It was awful. That's a bad trade, Mrs. That's poor arithmetic, and you're so good at arithmetic." She hit him. I have never told this to a living soul. Open hand across the face, hard enough to turn him, and the sound of it went up into the empty stone case and rang. And then she caught the front of his shirt with both fists and held him up, because he'd started to go down, and she put her forehead against his chest, her face against his chest. This woman who had not touched him in 19 months except to change a dressing. And she said something into his shirt that I could not hear, and that I would give the last of my life to have heard, and that she never repeated. Whatever it was, he stopped shaking. He lifted his one hand. He held it for a second an inch off her back. I saw it, hanging there, that big cracked hand hanging in the air over his wife like a hawk that couldn't decide. And I walked out of the mill and shut the door, because there are things a man has no business seeing, and I stood in the yard where Tsaya was setting the rollers, and Tsaya did not look up, and after a while he said to the timbers, not to me, "Hand me the shim." So I did. And out in the bottoms the cane stood 12 feet high in the last good light of that October. 1,000 acres of it, sweet and souring and worthless, and there were 34 days until the note. And inside the house a man was weeping and a woman was holding him up, and I wrote in my book that night in the wagon by lantern. Two of them, flat sheet iron evaporators 11 feet long and 4 wide, freighted down from Sedalia in the same load as the rollers, and they arrived with a hole in one the size of a man's fist where something had shifted on the road. Saya patched it with a scrap of the old headgate plate, and 100 rivets he cut himself out of horseshoe nails, and he worked on it from dark to dark for 2 days, and when he was done, he filled it with creek water and stood there looking at the seam for a long time with his good eye. Ruth said, "Does it hold?" He said, "It holds." "Will it hold hot?" And Saya said, "Everything holds until it is hot," which I put in my book, and which I have thought about at other times in my life for reasons that have nothing to do with syrup. Sorghum will teach you humility faster than a horse. Here is the whole ugly truth of it. You cut the cane, you strip the leaves, you top it, you haul it. You feed it through the rollers within about 4 days or the juice sours, and you have made yourself 11 quarts of expensive vinegar. The green juice comes off the rollers the color of pond water, and it must go straight into the pan and it must boil in a moving line, hot end to cold end. And you must skim the green scum as it rises or the syrup goes bitter and dark, and no man will buy it twice. And you cannot walk away from the pan, not for a minute, not for the length of time it takes to answer a call of nature unless somebody has the skimmer. If it scorches, it is gone, the whole pan, 70 gallons, ruined in 90 seconds, and it will taste like a burnt house forever. Ruth Vance had never made a gallon of syrup in her life. She had a pamphlet. That's what I want you to hold in your head. A woman with a debt of $640, 32 days, a crippled husband, no wheat, no stones, and a pamphlet, 12 pages, printed in Indiana, the Sorghum Grower's Manual, which she had bought for 15 cents off a drummer, and read so many times the fold went through the middle like a hinge. She burned the first pan. Not scorched, burned. She'd let the fire run too hot under the cold end because the book said keep a steady fire, and she took steady to mean even, which it does not. And at 4 in the morning on the 14th of October, 70 gallons of green sorghum juice went to tar in front of her, and the smell came up out of that boiling shed like the devil's own kitchen, and I was asleep 2 miles off and I smelled it. I rode over at first light because I knew what that smell was. She was sitting on the ground with her back against the pan foundation. Her face was black with smoke around the eyes where she'd wiped it. The fire was out. The pan was a ruin and would want scraping with a chisel for a day and a half. 21 cane loads, Willie Prout and Saya had cut and hauled for 3 days, gone. She had the pamphlet in her lap. She wasn't crying. She was reading it again, by the light of the coals, turning the pages with black fingers looking for the sentence she'd gotten wrong. I said her name. She held up one finger without looking up. "Wait." And after a while she said, out loud to nobody, "A steady fire under the finishing end and a live fire beneath the entry. Live, not steady." It says both words in one sentence, and I read it 40 times and I read it once. She put her head back against the iron. Then she said, "Corbin, I'm going to need to borrow your Willie for the cutting. I'll pay in syrup and I don't have syrup, so I'll pay in a note, and if I fail he'll have paper worth nothing and he's a boy, so I want you to tell me if that's wicked." I said it was near enough. She said, "Then I'll do it anyway," and got up and went to find a chisel. That's what she was. I'm not going to prettify it. She was not a saint, and I have never once said she was. She was a woman who would take a boy's labor on a bad note and lose sleep over it and take it anyway. And 30 years later that boy owned 400 acres on the Salt Fork and named a daughter for her. Both those things are true, and I have stopped trying to make them agree. They ran the second pan on the 16th and it came off pale gold and clean, and she poured a spoonful on a saucer and cooled it and tasted it. and she looked at Saya, and Saya tasted it and moved his shoulder about a quarter of an inch, which from him was a brass band. And then something happened that nobody planned, that no one could have planned, that I have come to think was the actual hinge of the whole business. She would not buy the cane. Every syrup man in Kansas bought cane. Standing crop, $2 an acre, cut it yourself, all the profit in the syrup. That was the trade. Ruth had no $2. So she went to Cheney and to old man Rennick, who had stood in my yard and called her a savage lover, and to the Proots and to 4 families down the creek, and she said this: "Bring me your cane, I'll crush it and boil it and barrel it. You keep 2 gallons of every 3, I keep 1. A toll, same as a grist mill takes a toll in meal." Nobody had ever heard of it. Every man in that valley had a bottom full of worthless cane and no way on God's earth to turn it into anything. And here was a woman saying, "Bring it, and I will make it into money, and most of the money is yours." Rennick came on the 18th, with 9 wagons behind him. I want to be honest about Rennick. He did not come because he'd repented. He came because he had 200 acres of cane and a mortgage and a sick wife, and because a man will make his peace with the devil for a crop, and he sat up on that wagon and would not look at Saya on the rollers, and he said to Ruth, "I ain't shaking hands." And Ruth said, "I'm not selling hands. 3rd wagon, back it to the chute." By the 22nd, there was a line of wagons on the Ford Road at daylight. By the 29th, she was boiling day and night in shifts, and I had quit my own place for the season and was firing the cold end, and Willie was on the rollers, and Saya slept 4 hours in the straw beside the pans and skimmed. He had a hand for it nobody could match. He'd pull that scum off in a single long sheet like a man skinning something, and the syrup that came out of his end of the pan was the color of new brass, and it was the reason, more than any other single reason, that Vance syrup got the price it got in Osterhout that November. Nobody knows that. Nobody ever knew it. His name is not on the sign either. Now Elias. He came out to the boiling shed on the 3rd night. He had not spoken to her, not spoken, not looked, since the 11th. He'd taken his meals in the front room. He'd walked the empty meal floor at night. I heard him up there once at 2 in the morning, walking the ring where the stone had been, round and round. And if you have never heard a man do that above your head while you fire a syrup pan, then I don't know how to give it to you. But on the 3rd night, he came down to the shed and stood in the door with his one hand hanging. The fire was up. It was hot as August in there. Ruth was at the finishing end with the skimmer, and she saw him, and her whole body went still, not tense, still, the way a rabbit does, and she did not put the skimmer down. Elias looked at the pan. He looked at the rollers, at the cane trash heaped up, at Willie asleep sitting upright against a barrel, at Saya feeding stalks. And he said, "Your fire's dying under the entry." Just that. Ruth said, "I know it." Well, he came in. He was very slow about it. I can't lift a stick of wood and hold the door with the one hand. Nobody moved. Then Ruth said, "Corbin will hold the door." And Elias Vance got down on his knees in the ash by the firebox and picked up cordwood 1 stick at a time with his one hand and fed the fire. And I held the iron door, and he fed it and got the live fire up under the entry end where the green juice came in, and he was crying the whole time silently, and none of us said one word about it, and none of us ever did. He fired that pan for the next 29 nights. He could not do it well. He'd get the wood in crooked and I'd fix it. He fell twice. Once he took hold of the door edge with his hand instead of the hook and burned his palm to the bone across all 4 fingers and would not stop, would not go up to the house, wrapped it in a strip off his own shirt with his teeth and went back down on his knees. And Ruth watched that from the finishing end and did not stop him. That was her second heavy decision, if you want to count them, and I do. She let him burn. She let him hurt himself at the fire because she understood, better than I did, better than he did, that a man who has said you should have let me die in the pit needs work more than he needs a bandage, and that if she came down that pan and took the wood out of his hand, she would kill him more surely than the gears ever tried to. He never got the use of that hand fully back. The fingers stayed curled after. He signed his name crooked the rest of his life. I have his signature in my book on a receipt from 1901. It looks like a man leaning into a wind. November 14th, 1884. Cold, bright, no wind, the ground ringing under a wagon. Amos Dunning came at 11 in the morning with his clerk and a deputy, and he wore the linen duster even in the cold, and he had the papers in a leather case on his knees. Ruth met him in the yard. She had been up 31 hours. There were 61 barrels of sorghum syrup stacked under a tarp behind the boiling shed, and 109 more sold and delivered, and she had ridden to Osterhout twice and to Kingman once, and stood in front of grocers and boarding house keepers, and the Santa Fe eating house man with a saucer and a spoon in her hand, and made them taste it. And she had a bank draft in her apron pocket for $418, and cash for the rest. And she had counted it 11 times on the ride home. Dunning got down. He looked at the barrels. He looked at the mill with no stones in it. He said, "Mrs. Vance, I've come to be sorry about this." And Ruth took the money out of her apron and held it out and said, "$640, and the interest is $9.60, and you'll write me a receipt on the wagon board because I'm not going in the house." I was there. Dunning did not take it, not right away. He stood there in his clean duster in that dirty yard, and he looked at that money, and something went across his kind, small face that I did not understand at the time, and that I have spent 40 years understanding since. It wasn't anger, it wasn't disappointment. It was relief. He'd been sure. He'd done his arithmetic and he'd been right, and being right had meant putting a one-armed man and his wife off a place in the winter, and he'd been carrying that for 5 months in that leather case. He took the money. He wrote the receipt on the wagon board with his own pen, and his hand shook a little, and he blew on the ink. Then he said, "Where will you get stones?" And Ruth said, "I won't. You've got a mill with no. I've got a syrup house with a good race and 11 cords of wood and 200 families in this county who will plant cane in the spring, because I showed them a market." She folded the receipt into 4. "And in March I'm coming to your bank, Mr. Dunning, to borrow $800 for a second pan and a bottling shed, and you're going to lend it to me." Dunning put his hat on. He said, and I swear this, and Willie Prout heard it too, and Willie told it the same way at his own table for 50 years, he said, "Ma'am, I believe I am. I'll go quick over the good years, because good years don't want telling and you didn't come for them. 85, they planted cane on 1,100 acres in that valley. 86, she put in the second pan and the bottling shed and a label with a picture of the wheel on it. 87, she went to St. Louis on the cars, alone, in a black dress she'd made herself, and came back with a contract to supply a wholesale grocer with 400 barrels a year. And the man who signed it wrote to a friend that he had dealt with a Mr. R. Vance and found him shrewd. And Ruth read that letter and laughed until she had to sit down on the step. She never corrected him either. By 91, there were 300 people in that valley whose whole cash income came off her chute, and she'd put in a cooperage, and she'd hired Saya's sister's boy and 2 Cheney girls in the bottling shed, and a fellow from the Kansas Agricultural College came out to write down her boiling method, and she gave him the whole of it, every bit, for nothing, and he printed it, and it is in a book in Manhattan, Kansas, to this day. And her name is not on that either because he called it the Cimarron method. She said she didn't mind. She said a method wants using, a name only wants saying. And she pressed her thumbnail into her finger while she said it, and I looked away, because by then I knew what that meant. 1887, I have to tell about the soldier. The drought that year broke the corn in June. By August, the Cimarron was down to a chain of green pools, and the race ran a hand's width, and the wheel would not turn, and Ruth had 180 barrels contracted for St. Louis and no water to crush with. Saya said the Salt Fork had a spring under it at the horseshoe, up above his dugout, and that if they cut a lateral ditch 1.3 miles across Rennick's north pasture and Kemp's grass, they could feed the race off it. And the water was there. He'd known it was there for 9 years. He had watched where the frost came out first in March. So Ruth went to Rennick. And Rennick, old, sick wife dead by then. 4 sons, Rennick said yes in about 11 seconds, because he had 400 acres of cane in the bottom that year, and the whole thing lived or died on her wheel turning. That's what money does. It doesn't make a man good. It makes him reasonable, which from a distance you can't tell apart. They cut the ditch in 19 days. And on the 28th of August, a lieutenant from Fort Supply rode up the Ford Road with 6 troopers. He was maybe 24. He had a printed order and a name on it, not Saya's name. A Chiricahua name I couldn't say then and won't try now. And he sat his horse in the yard and read it out, that all Chiricahua persons at large were to be gathered and shipped to the Alabama camps where the others had gone the year before, and that harboring was a federal matter. Elias came out on the step. Ruth came out of the bottling shed with a stave hammer still in her hand. The lieutenant was polite, that's what I remember. He called her ma'am 4 times. He said he understood the man had been useful. He said there was a procedure. And Ruth said, he's not here. And the lieutenant looked past her at the boiling shed, where the door stood open, and there was 1 skimmer hanging on the wall out of 2. He said, ma'am, I have to look. She said, then look. He looked. He was in that shed a long minute. He came out and he stood in the yard and he looked at the 1.3 of new ditch cutting across Rennick's pasture with the water in it, silver in that killing August light, running downhill to a wheel that was turning, and every man there knew, every single one of us standing in that yard knew, who had laid that line. And the lieutenant folded up his order and put it in his coat and said, well, he's not here. Then he took his troopers north to Osterhout and got drunk, and I never learned his name and I have wanted it, some nights, badly. Saya was in the tail race, under the wheel, in the water in the dark behind the buckets, and he had been there since the dust came up the Ford Road, and the wheel was turning, and it turned over his head for 40 minutes at 11 revolutions to the minute with about 4 inches to spare, and if his foot had slipped on the stone. That was the decision, hers. She sent him down there. She could have sent him up the creek and he'd have been caught in the open, or she could have hidden him in the house and let them search it and let it be a crime, or she could have done the third thing, which is what she did. She said, get in the tail race and I will not stop the wheel, because a stopped wheel is a shout. And she stood in that yard for 40 minutes and lied to a lieutenant of the United States Army with her husband's mill grinding away over her friend's head, and her face did nothing at all. When they were gone, she walked out to the wheel and she did not run. He came up out of the water gray, not from cold. He was 53 by then. He sat down on the stone lip of the pit and put his head between his knees and stayed there, and Ruth sat down beside him in her good dress in the mud and did not touch him and did not speak, for what my book says was 1 hour and 10 minutes. She wrote nothing about it, I did. He stayed until 1893. Then one spring morning he was not in his dugout, and the tools were stacked, and the melons were planted. She never spoke his name after that. Not once, in my hearing, in 26 years, and I understood it as coldness for a long, long time. It was not coldness. There were census men, there were land agents. It was the last thing she could give him, not saying it. Elias Vance died on the 9th of February, 1902, of pneumonia in the front room, 67 years old. The last 4 years he kept the books. I want to close that circle. He sat in the office with the ledger squared and the pen in his crooked left hand, and he did the accounts of a business that shipped 900 barrels a year to 4 states, and he was slow, and he was accurate, and he liked it. And when a drummer came, he would say, "I'll have to ask my wife," with a straight face, and then sit there enjoying it. Once, 98, a buyer from Wichita came out and shook Elias' hand and congratulated him on what he'd built. And Elias said, "Oh, I didn't build it. I lost an arm and my father's stones and my nerve in that order, and my wife built it on the wreckage. I fire the pans in season. I'm a fair fireman." The buyer laughed. He thought it was modesty. That's the thing about the truth. Say it plain enough and everybody hears a joke. She died in 1911. She was 59. I'm 81 and I have outlived every soul in this account, which is its own kind of joke. And it isn't lost on me that I've become the only man who can say what happened and the last man anybody would believe. 2 years before she died, she had the sign repainted, the big one at the Ford. I drove her out to see it done. She stood in the road with her hands folded and watched the painter go over the letters. VNC Milling. Same as it ever was, same as Absalom had it. And I said I'd waited 20 years to say it, and I said it badly. I said, "Ruth, put your name on it." She looked at the sign a while. She said, "It is my name." And I said, "No, you know what I mean. Put Ruth on it. Put the whole of it. There's men in 3 states think a fellow named Vance did this with his 2 hands, and one of them is dead and never had 2 hands to." And she stopped me by putting her fingers on my sleeve, which she had done maybe 4 times in 27 years. She said, "Corbin, he married me to help at the mill." I said I knew that. I said I'd read the letter. "He got what he asked for," she said. "Every word of it. He asked for a woman who was strong and could work, and there was to be sacking and hauling, and the noise was considerable." Her mouth went sideways, a little, the closest thing she had. "He didn't ask for a partner, and he didn't ask to be loved, and he got both of those anyway, late, at a bad price, and he never once complained about the terms." The painter was doing the careful work. He had a little maul stick. She watched him. "Let him have the sign," she said. "I've got the mill." And she pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her finger. I saw it. I have never not seen it. And she got up in the wagon and said we'd best get on. The 4 o'clock cars were coming, and there was Kane on the Rennick Road. "There is one more thing, and then I'm finished." When we cleared out the office after her funeral, the drawer where the sample scoops were had Elias' letter in it, the matrimonial one, folded so many times it had gone to lint at the creases. And on the back of it, in her hand, in pencil, dated in a year I couldn't make out, 84. I think, from the shake of it, though it may have been later, it may have been much later. She had written out her answer, the one she'd mailed him. She'd kept a copy, the way she kept a copy of everything, because she was a woman who wrote the date in the book when other people didn't. It said, "Mr. Vance, I am strong and I can work. I do not require affection. I require a place where what I do is mine. I will come on the coach on the 9th. Arlisle. P.S. What is the water like?" I have carried that in my pocketbook for 4 years. I take it out sometimes and read the postscript, and I think about a woman in Ohio in 1883 with a carpetbag and an empty fiddle case, sitting down at somebody else's table to answer an advertisement from a tired man who wanted hands, and asking about the river,